Napoleon, who despised him and saw right through him, was always prepared to exploit this Achilles' heel. He intrigued against Godoy with the infant Ferdinand, then set it up so that his young ally was arrested for treason, giving him the pretext to intervene. By 1808, Godoy was universally unpopular and held to blame for all the symbols of Spanish decline: the economic depression, price inflation, dear bread, the loss of the American market, the unpopular war with Britain, which exacerbated the economic crisis, and most of all the scandalous disgrace of a royal family in which the Queen was believed to entertain this low-born impostor as a lover. Passions in Spain finally boiled over at Aranjuez on the 17th of March 1808. A mob of soldiers, peasants and palace grooms forced Charles IV to dismiss Godoy, who was found hiding in a rolled-up carpet. 2 days later, another mob obliged the king to abdicate in favor of his son, the Prince of Asturias, who briefly became Ferdinand IV. Using this revolt as a pretext, Napoleon ordered Murat and a large body of troops to Madrid, where they arrived on the 23rd of March. This so-called tumult of Aranjuez was not the work of liberal opinion, but of a group of malcontent nobles in alliance with the court faction of the Prince of Asturias, using as their instrument the army and the mob. Historians have seen this as another manifestation of the Hidalgo tradition. The grandees could stomach rule by bureaucrats but not by parvenu court favorites like Godoy. There was particular animus between Ferdinand and Godoy, as the prince believed Godoy was aiming at a regency to exclude him from the throne, while Godoy was aware that the prince was intriguing against him with Bonaparte through the French ambassador. Godoy was shrewd enough to see that the tumult of Aranjuez was not a spontaneous popular uprising, but the work of the exploited masses manipulated from above. In retrospect, it looks like just another in the long line of demonstrations of political power by the alliance between the army and the mob which habitually decided the fate of kings and ministers in 19th-century Spain. The Spanish story abounds in ironies, and none richer than the fall of Godoy. The first minister had just decided that Napoleon must be opposed before he took over Spain, and to this end elected to remove the king to safety in Seville, a step which ironically triggered the tumult. Ferdinand was at this stage virtually a creature of Bonaparte, and by far Napoleon's wisest course would have been to set him on the throne as a puppet. But, showing the first clear signs of self-destructive behavior, Napoleon set off for Bayonne in April with quite other ideas in his mind. Passing swiftly through Tours, Poitiers and Angoulême, he stopped in Bordeaux for 10 days, sightseeing and attending receptions. On the 14th of April he arrived at Bayonne and settled in for 3 months at the Chateau of Mirac, ready to put the final touches to his Spanish policy. His first action at Bayonne was scarcely an act of consummate statesmanship. The Bayonne decrees of the 17th of April declared all American ships entering European ports to be lawful prize. Napoleon argued that since the USA had embargoed its own ships, any vessels purporting to come from North America must be British merchantmen in disguise, bearing forged papers. This attempt to plug another hole in the continental system simply increased friction unnecessarily with the USA. But as a blunder, it was a bagatelle alongside what was to follow. On 8 April he offered to mediate between father and son and summoned both Charles IV and Ferdinand to meet him. The deposed Charles was predictably keen to have Napoleon as a supposed champion, but Ferdinand was less certain of the wisdom of making the journey. To help him make up his mind, the emperor sent his favorite troubleshooter Savary to entice him to Bayonne with specious promises. The brutal Savary, whose destiny seemed to be to destroy young princes, was the man of whom Napoleon once said, "If I ordered Savary to murder his wife and children, I know he would do it without a moment's hesitation." This was the man whose blandishments Ferdinand was stupid enough to trust. He arrived at Bayonne on the 20th of April, 10 days before his father. It took a week for Napoleon to bend the Bourbons to his will. On the 5th of May there was a violent scene, which ended with the emperor threatening to execute Ferdinand there, and then if he did not abdicate in favor of his father. Already revealed as a fool, the prince proved himself a coward also. Without even trying to call Bonaparte's bluff, he caved in and acknowledged Charles as king. Charles then immediately handed his crown over to Napoleon, who eventually gave it to his brother Joseph. A junta of Francophile Spaniards already summoned to Bayonne ratified the arrangement. Ferdinand and his brothers were held in France under house arrest, while Charles and Godoy were exiled to Compiègne. With a choice sense of irony, Napoleon selected Talleyrand as the man who would have the honor of offering Ferdinand hospitality on his estate at Valent. Emperor conceded that his Spanish policy was one of his greatest errors. It has been described, not unjustifiably, as an ambush and compared to the crimes of Tiberius. On St. Helena, Napoleon conceded his mistake and tried to rewrite history by producing a letter in which he rebuked Murat for having misled him over the true state of Spanish opinion. Even at the time he was aware of the propaganda gift he had made over to his enemies. "My action is not good from a certain point of view, I know, but my policy demands that I shall not leave in my rear, so close to Paris, a dynasty hostile to mine." On St. Helena he was more frank. "I embarked very badly on the Spanish affair, I confess. The immorality of it was too patent, the injustice too cynical. His solution to the Spanish problem was also deeply flawed and his approach to it puzzling. Before giving the crown to Joseph, he had offered it to Louis, although he, as King of Holland, had opposed his brother most strongly. Joseph was reluctant to take on the task and at first accepted only on condition he could also be King of Naples. Napoleon forced him to opt for the Spanish throne, though Joseph always hankered after his beloved Naples and always felt he had made a mistake. Even more bizarre is Napoleon's penchant for arbitrary swaps. The obvious candidate for the Spanish throne was Murat, who openly lusted after it and had even made dispositions in Madrid as if the result was a foregone conclusion. As a consolation prize, he was prepared to accept the throne of Portugal, but at first fumed with anger when Napoleon spoke of him as a necessary cog in his Italian policy. With extreme reluctance, Murat took over Joseph's old role as King of Naples. Why, in any case, did Napoleon persevere with people who had already proved they were useless? Did he think that, because they were blood of his blood, his brothers must have talent if they would only exert themselves? Or did he simply act from crude Corsican family feeling? Murat's form was fully exposed and Napoleon cannot have had a high opinion of him as an administrator, yet he used him for a post fraught with dangers and one, moreover, that held out myriad temptations for a man of Murat's overweening ambition. Beyond that is the glaringly obvious fact that the entire system of vassal kings contained irreconcilable contradictions. A credible monarch had to identify with the people and nation he ruled, yet Napoleon insisted that his brother kings be first and foremost loyal Frenchmen, ready to anticipate the emperor's slightest wishes. By becoming entangled in Spain, Napoleon evinced pride, arrogance and lack of imagination. Pride, because he could not believe that anyone would resist his will; arrogance, because he thought that even if armed opposition arose, the task of suppressing it would be a military walkover; and lack of imagination in that he could not understand that other peoples could be just as much motivated by national pride as the French were. He failed to see the quicksands yawning before him or to intuit the vibrancy of a nation of 12 million inhabitants in arms. By no stretch of the imagination did the Spanish adventure answer French national interests. It blew the notion of natural frontiers sky high and emphasized the divide between genuinely French national needs and the purely dynastic ambitions of the Bonapartes. Economically, the chance for loot aside, the Spanish incursion made no sense. A few businessmen looked forward to seizing Iberian wool and Latin American silver, but even these hopes proved chimerical. France had been grudgingly behind Napoleon during the wars of R805-07 but almost universally opposed this foray south of the Pyrenees. The opposition was perhaps especially marked in Bordeaux and the southwest of France. Above all, Spain drove a wedge between Napoleon and the notables, those bourgeois pillars of his rule. From May R808 the emperor was on a downhill slide towards ultimate disaster. On the 2nd of the month there was an uprising in Madrid, which Murat suppressed bloodily, and which has been immortalized in Goya's painting. But this was merely the first of many outbreaks. On the 20th of May the pro-French governor of Badajoz was murdered by a mob. 2 days later the same fate overtook the governor of Cartagena. On the 23rd of May the province of Valencia rose. On the 24th Asturias. On the 27th Seville. Oviedo rebelled on the 24th. Zaragoza on the 25th. Galicia on the 3rd. Catalonia on the 7th of June. By what seemed like chain reaction, the splitting molecule of revolution produced a mighty holocaust. Napoleon should have realized the strength of feeling in Spain and cut his losses, but, like a fanatic, redoubled his efforts when he had lost sight of his aim. Murat claimed that it was the emperor's attitude that was the cause of the prairie fire rapidity of the Spanish revolt. When Murat complained about the difficulty of getting supplies, Napoleon replied impatiently that he should live off the land and take by force whatever he wanted. He was tired of a general who at the head of S0000 troops asks for things instead of taking them. Murat claimed that he sat stunned when he read the letter as if a tile had fallen on his head. Who, then, were these Spanish revolutionaries and what were their aims? At first the different risings were separate manifestations of frustrated localism, using anger about Bayonne and Madrid on the 2nd of May as pretexts. Local grievances, expectations and disappointments found a focus in acute xenophobia, and were legitimated in anti-French propaganda portraying Ferdinand as the desired one. Initial resistance was from local notables and commanders, since Ferdinand had instructed his junta in Madrid to cultivate the French at all costs. It was only much later, when the rising was in full swing, that Ferdinand rescinded his orders to the Madrid junta. Historians differ on the nature of the Spanish rising. Some say the revolt was led by those implicated in the plot against Godoy, and was thus a continuation of the tumult of Aranjuez. Others hold that the tumult and the revolt are distinct, with the latter a mindless outburst of fanatical xenophobia led by the regular clergy, especially monks and friars. The second is the interpretation Napoleon himself always promoted, for obvious propagandist reasons, to portray the rising as benighted reaction against reform and the Enlightenment, and to mask his own blunder at Bayonne, but it is not thereby fallacious. One thing is certain, the rising initially found Spain as divided as ever it had been under Godoy. the middle and upper classes were circumspect, since they saw clearly that the price of defeating the French might be power to the people. Having observed the French Revolution, they realized it might then be their turn to be overthrown. Also, the fact that Charles and Ferdinand had abdicated legally placed them in a quandary, since the only non-circular way to challenge Joseph's succession would be by appealing to popular sovereignty, with the same possible horrific outcome. There was therefore nothing for it but that judges, magistrates and officials should cooperate with the invaders, who formed the military arm of a legally constituted monarch. In the occupied parts of Spain the propertied classes collaborated with the French, but in the unoccupied areas the xenophobic mob swept all before it, including vacillating local bureaucrats. Peasants, students and religious raided arsenals, erected gallows and instituted a reign of terror that made the propertied fear for their own skins. In panic they joined in and declared war on the French, seeing that if they remained aloof, the result might be peasant anarchy. Local notables and military officers joined the revolution so as to control it. Napoleon, absurdly complacent, meanwhile basked in the illusion that the propertied would be bound to rally to him out of fear of the mob and that his only important task was to win over the captains general of the localities. This was just one of a plethora of errors the increasingly accident-prone emperor made in Spain. To an extent he was unlucky in that, having squared the Iberian bourgeoisie, he encountered wholly unexpected opposition from the church, the peasantry and the urban proletariat. This was not so much patriotism but rather a twofold reaction against the economic depression resulting from Napoleon's continental system, and resistance to the kind of socio-economic changes the pro-French faction wanted to introduce. The Bayonne coup, though often cited as the cause of the uprising, was the occasion rather than the deep motor of insurrection. Napoleon's lack of imagination was palpable. He seems to have assumed that 1808 in Spain could simply be a rerun of 1789 in France, with a nascent bourgeoisie eager to seize power. Just a little social analysis would have revealed to him that this enlightened faction of Spanish bourgeoisie was too small to serve as the social basis of state power. For anyone who cared to look at Spain with an unjaundiced eye, there were clear and ominous signs of things to come. England's aim was to see that the insurrection did not splinter into warlordism, so London backed the formation of a national junta under Jovellanos, which issued pronunciamientos at Seville and Cadiz, declaring war on France in the name of Ferdinand VII. After some hesitation, the British also decided to send a 9,000-strong army to the peninsula under General Arthur Wellesley, and to supply the revolutionary juntas through Gibraltar. Napoleon was soon disabused of his notion that pacifying Spain was a mere police operation. Besiers won a victory over the rebels at Medina del Campo in Galicia on the 14th of July, which allowed Joseph to enter Madrid, but the new king was taken aback by his icy reception and wrote about it in some alarm to his brother. But the French failed to take Zaragoza in Aragon. In Catalonia, General Duchesne was bottled up in Barcelona, in the southeast. To Napoleon's fury, money fell back from Valencia to Alcana. Worse was to follow. Napoleon gave the task of conquering Andalusia to General Dupont, and a corps of conscripts. Dupont moved down from Toledo, with Cadiz as his objective, and sacked Cordoba. But then everything went wrong. Half-starved after the severing of its supply lines, heavily outnumbered by the rebels and suffering the burden of Dupont's horrible generalship, this 19,000-strong army surrendered to the junta forces under Castafios on the 22nd of July at Bailén, at the foot of the Sierra Morena. This was the first defeat of the emperor's troops in open country, but it was scarcely a victory over the elite of Austerlitz, as the Spanish imagined. In panic, Joseph quit Madrid and skulked on the French border. Already the war was acquiring the savage character that would make it infamous in the annals of man's inhumanity to man. After Bailén, the Spanish violated the terms of capitulation by leaving 10,000 troops to perish on a barren island because, as they put it, they saw no reason to obey the rules of war when dealing with a captain of bandits. Zaragoza, having held out for 2.5 months against a large siege train, even though poorly fortified, was then the scene of sanguinary house-to-house street fighting. French patrols were ambushed and cut down to the last man, if they were lucky. If they were unlucky, they were reserved for horrible deaths by mutilation, crucifixion, being nailed to trees, boiled in oil, drowned or buried alive. The crazed xenophobia of the juntas must bear some of the blame for the descent into barbarism. An inflammatory proclamation by the Valencia junta on the 7th of June R809 said of the French, "They have behaved worse than a horde of Hottentots. They have profaned our temples, insulted our religion and raped our women." It must be conceded that the French gave as good as they got. Dupont sacked Cordoba, and elsewhere Spain was given over to the looting of a Napoleonic soldiery imbued with a spirit wherein a rational system of living off the land by military requisition had yielded to an anarchy of rapine and plunder. The French were devotees of mass execution, usually without trial. They dispatched hundreds by firing squad and hanged, looted and raped with gusto. repression and backlash, atrocity and counter-atrocity plunged the country into an inferno of brutality and degradation. The breakdown of all social order had predictable results. Soon the country hovered on the brink of famine. The writer George Sand remembered vividly the terrible scenes in Spain in R808 when she traveled there as a child with her father. She existed on raw onions, sunflower seeds, green lemons and soup made of candle ends, which she shared with the soldiers. She remembered the noise of the wagon in which she lay as it crunched over the bones of corpses in the road, and recalled once clutching at the sleeve of a trooper only to find his arm empty. SMG. The resistance on the peninsula spread to Portugal, where Wellington landed at Oporto and soon had an army of R60 behind him. The impulsive Junot foolishly attacked with inferior numbers and was defeated at Vimero. The Convention of Sintra, to Spanish fury, allowed for the repatriation of French forces in English ships, together with all their equipment and loot. Wellington was opposed to such liberal terms, but his last-minute supersession by General Byrd, reflecting and fighting in London, took the shine off Vimero, and it was Byrd who let the French off the hook with the Sintra Agreement. A disconsolate Wellington temporarily returned to the post of Irish Secretary in London. The British then marched into Galicia, where the locals welcomed them with open arms. The Vimero defeat was played up for its full propaganda worth in the London broadsheets, where it was claimed that Napoleon himself had been worsted. A facile moment of opportunism by the emperor had plunged the Grand Army into the maelstrom. To an extent he was protected from the immediate consequences of his own error, for news of Baylen did not catch up with him until he was almost back at St. Cloud. After leaving Bayonne on the 21st of July, he made the most leisurely progress back to Paris, visiting Toulouse, Montauban, Agen, Bordeaux, Rochefort, Niort, Nantes, Tours and Blois as if he were a 19th-century tourist of the most ambling sort. But the news of Baylen shook him from his torpor, for he immediately realized that he had plunged himself into a deadly struggle in Spain. The shock news of Baylen would give fresh heart to his enemies in Germany, and perhaps even tempt the spirits of Prussian and Austrian revanchism. Preoccupied with the thought of keeping Austria quiet, so that if necessary he could shift further corps of the Grand Army to Spain, Napoleon at once made arrangements for another summit meeting with Tsar Alexander. Meanwhile he made contingency plans for transferring W0000 men under Ney, Victor and Mortier from the Elbe to the peninsula. Intense diplomatic activity then went on to set up the earliest possible reunion of the two most powerful men in Europe. A venue was agreed at Erfurt, a temporary French enclave in Thuringen. Napoleon set out from St. Cloud on the 22nd of September for another encounter with the man he thought he had overcome with charm. He had two objectives: securing his rear against Austria, and achieving a dynastic marriage with the Tsar's sister. The Erfurt conference was not destined to be a success. There were two main reasons. The parties had not been honest with each other at Tilsit, and since then clouds had gathered over the makeshift relationship. Both Napoleon and Alexander had always regarded the Tilsit Treaty as a way of buying time. There is the clearest possible statement of Napoleon's position in a cynical letter he sent to his ambassador in St. Petersburg, Louis de Caulaincourt, on the 29th of January 1808. But he saw the need to keep the Tsar sweet, and 4 days later he sent Alexander a long letter offering to share a dismembered Ottoman Empire with him. As he explained in a letter to his brother Louis a fortnight later, he was deeply influenced by the speech from the throne at the beginning of 1808 when George III made clear his determination to continue the war. Angered by Albion's intransigence, Napoleon tried to tighten up the plans he had laid with Alexander at Tilsit for a Franco-Russian pincer movement on India. But, the insincerity of the two parties apart, events had already moved on since Tilsit. The Tsar was increasingly convinced that even the stopgap accord at Tilsit had been simply one-way traffic in Napoleon's favor. He liked the emperor personally, but his affection was not shared at the Russian court. When he returned home after Tilsit, he was alarmed to find how high feelings were running on the treaty. There were even whispers of a coup to replace him with a more francophobe ruler. Remembering the fate of his father, who had been betrayed by his courtiers for precisely this reason, Alexander began to renege on Tilsit. The anti-French party at St. Petersburg certainly had a case when they argued that the Entente with France worked against Russian interests. French hegemony in the Baltic stood in the way of Russian expansion into Finland. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a French vassal state in the Russian sphere of influence, especially rankled. In Prussia, France had agreed to evacuate the country by October 1808 but showed no signs of a phased withdrawal. Napoleon indeed was delaying the evacuation on the grounds that he had to have every last penny of the war indemnity before pulling out. And whereas Napoleon had agreed to a division of Turkey and often talked about it, he remained evasively silent on the key question of who would control Constantinople. Most disadvantageous of all were the economic protocols agreed at Tilsit. Exports of corn, hemp and wood destined for England had been embargoed because of the continental system. Moreover, France made no offer of compensation but retained a favorable balance of trade with Russia, leaving her with a ruinous glut of hemp, wood, tallow, pitch, potassium, leather and iron. Of 338 ships recorded as leaving Russian ports in 809, only one was bound for Bordeaux, and meanwhile France exported to Russia luxuries like spirits, scents, porcelain and jewelry instead of the goods she really needed. A gesture of goodwill in advance of the Erfurt Conference was needed, so Napoleon announced he would evacuate Prussia immediately, provided the full reparations of 140 million francs were paid first, and Prussia agreed to limit its army to 42,000 men. But even this concession did not seem to thaw the frosty relations between Paris and St. Petersburg. Napoleon's secret instructions to Talleyrand were to secure a treaty that would tighten the screws on England and make Russia in effect Austria's jailer, while giving him a free hand in Spain. Since the duplicitous Talleyrand was already working against him, this seemed a forlorn hope, but the emperor limited the foreign minister's scope for double-dealing by insisting on two clauses: that he, not Alexander, should determine the criteria for Russia's going to war with Austria, and that Russian troops should at once mass on the Austrian border. Napoleon arrived in Erfurt on the 27th of September, welcomed the Tsar and spent the rest of the day with him. The two men were together until the 14th of October. Immense efforts had been made to impress Alexander with French power, as Napoleon had explained to Talleyrand in his original letter of instruction. "Before we begin, I wish the Emperor Alexander to be dazzled by the spectacle of my power. Use the language he understands. Tell him that the grand designs of Providence are evident in the benefits our alliance will have for mankind." To this end he had summoned all the vassal kings of Bavaria, Saxony and Württemberg, and all the dukes and princes of the Confederation of the Rhine to meet him at Erfurt. Sumptuous apartments were put at the disposal of Alexander and his retinue, all furnished with paintings, sculptures and tapestries sent from France as if they were a traveling museum exhibit. Lavish banquets were prepared by French chefs. There were shooting parties and daily receptions, balls or fêtes. Napoleon's favorite actor, Talma, came from Paris with the Comédie Française to perform. The social round worked out magnificently. On the 7th of October, Napoleon took Alexander on a tour of the battlefield of Jena and talked him through all the military maneuvers. Afterwards, a hunt of hares and partridges was conducted over the terrain of the battlefield. The tenor of the day before can be gauged from a letter Napoleon sent to Josephine on the 6th. "Emperor Alexander danced, but I didn't. After all, 40 years old is 40 years old." Another letter to Josephine hints at the repressed homosexual elements in the emperor's makeup. "I am satisfied with Alexander and he should be satisfied with me. If he were a woman, I think I would make him my mistress." The way they actually bonded was itself curious. In Napoleon's retinue was his old mistress Emma Burgoyne, the woman he had stolen from Chaptal. When Alexander took a strong fancy to her, Napoleon tried to head off the liaison, fearing that she would reveal intimate secrets of the boudoir. But Alexander insisted he must have her, and so it transpired. The talks themselves, by contrast, were a huge disappointment to Napoleon. This was hardly surprising, since Talleyrand was engaged in a daily game of sabotage. After being briefed by Napoleon and encouraged to see the Tsar privately, he would visit Alexander and reveal every aspect of Napoleon's hand. On his very first meeting with the Tsar, Talleyrand begged him to resist the emperor with all his might, since Napoleon's foreign policy no longer answered French national interests. Talleyrand told Alexander that the tacit social alliance between Napoleon and the notables was at an end, that the notables wanted nothing but the natural frontiers and viewed with extreme alarm both Napoleon's German expansionism and his quixotic foray into Spain. The consequence was that the Tsar refused to accept Napoleon's two extraordinary clauses. The highly unsatisfactory final protocol signed on 2 October dealt with marginal matters. To secure a breakthrough at Erfurt, Napoleon had to give Alexander a free hand in Poland and, especially, give him Turkey. For mysterious and unexplained reasons, Napoleon could not bring himself to do so. Almost certainly the explanation is the Oriental complex, for such obstinacy has no rational basis. He did concede the Tsar Finland and the Romanian provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia, but that was about the only significant content in the Treaty of Erfurt. All the concessions were on Napoleon's side: a reduction of Prussia's war indemnity by 20 million francs, a promise not to intervene in any conflict between Russia and Turkey, and the meaningless acceptance of Russia's mediation in the conflict with England. Article Rho pledged the Tsar to go to war if Austria attacked France, but the article was vaguely worded, allowing Alexander several loopholes. When Napoleon sent a minatory letter to the Austrian emperor, designed to preempt any attempts at revanchism, Alexander refused to be a co-signatory. The most signal failure at Erfurt was the farcical attempt to secure a dynastic marriage. Talleyrand pretended to be making strenuous efforts to this end, but all the time was sabotaging his master's policy. Every time Napoleon complained about the Tsar's evasiveness, Talleyrand would assure him that Alexander was as taken with him as ever. Then he would depart for a tea-time rendezvous with the Tsar, and together they would plot a fresh item of verbal obfuscation with which to bamboozle Napoleon. Face to face with the emperor, Alexander claimed to be enthusiastic for the idea of Napoleon's marriage to his sister, save only that he needed the consent of the Dowager Empress. In the end, Napoleon grew so frustrated with Alexander's stalling that he stayed up late with Talleyrand, in a state of high agitation. Tell him I will agree with him on any of his plans for the partition of Turkey. Use any arguments you want. I know you favor the divorce. Josephine favors it too. There can be no question of Napoleon's sincere desire to marry the Grand Duchess Catherine. To Caulaincourt he wrote that he was making this union the acid test of the Tsar's friendship, for it would be a real sacrifice for me. I love Josephine. I will never be happier with anyone else, but my family and Talleyrand and Fouch and all the politicians insist upon it in the name of France. When the two autocrats parted on the 14th of October without agreement on this, or indeed anything of real value, Napoleon's dismay was palpable. One can almost sense the depression behind his laconic words to Joseph. In a letter on the 13th of October, "I've finished all my business with the Tsar of Russia." Savary confirmed next day, when the Tsar left, that the emperor was in a sad and pensive mood, as if he knew the conference had been a failure. It could scarcely have failed in a more spectacular way. Almost as if he were slapping his friend in the face, a month later the Tsar announced that his sister, Grand Duchess Catherine, would be marrying the Prince of Oldenburg. Since Alexander's other sister, Anna, was only 14 and not yet considered of a marriageable age, it was clear that the Russians had slammed the door on dynastic union with France. Nor was this the worst of it. Talleyrand, already in the pay of the Austrians, leaked the treaty to Vienna, together with intelligence of Alexander's refusal to back Napoleon in any war with Austria. The Austrians at once took a secret decision for a spring offensive. Pausing just a few days in Paris, Napoleon left for Spain on the 29th of October. With him he took 60,000 men divided into 7 army corps under Lannes, Soult, Ney, Victor, Lefebvre, Mortier and Gouvion-Saint-Cyr. Accompanied by the Imperial Guard, the emperor made rapid southward progress via Enghien and Bordeaux and arrived in Bayonne on the 3rd of November. When he crossed the Spanish border next day, he met a deputation of Capuchin monks at Tolosa, angry at the role of the regular clergy in the Spanish insurrection. He warned them forcefully, "If you monks have the effrontery to meddle in military affairs, I promise you I'll cut off your ears." After spending 4 days in Vitoria, on the 9th of November Napoleon opened his campaign proper. Since the Spanish armies were aiming to encircle Joseph's forces, the emperor decided to turn the tables by picking off each enemy wing in turn. Dividing his army into 3, he opted for simultaneous flank attacks on the isolated Spanish wings while the remaining third pressed on for Madrid. The first of many disappointments in this Spanish campaign was the lackluster performance of the marshals. Lefebvre and Victor, consumed by mutual jealousy, allowed the Spanish army of Galicia to escape. Lefebvre failed to cooperate effectively with Victor and jumped the gun, thus alerting the Spanish of the danger in which they stood and allowing them to retreat. The other Spanish army got clear away when Lannes and Ney also failed to spring the trap effectively. But this plan, to encircle the army of Castafios, with Lannes making a frontal attack while Ney worked round to the rear, was more controversial. While Napoleon railed at Ney for incompetence, accusing him of arriving on the scene 3 days too late, revisionist military scholars have fastened the blame on the emperor himself for failing to calculate the marching distances correctly. By the time Napoleon reached Burgos on November, it was clear there would be no repeat of Austerlitz or Jena. He had to spend 12 days in Burgos whipping his own undisciplined and insubordinate troops into line, which he did by some exemplary hangings and other draconian punishments. After a further week's preparations at Aranda de Douro, the Grand Army finally commenced its push on Madrid. On the 30th of November there was a bloody engagement in the Samosira Pass, which later critics adduced as yet another sign that the emperor was losing his grip. Frustrated and irritated by the doughty resistance of the Spanish army in the pass, Napoleon ordered the 3rd Squadron of Polish Light Horse to make a frontal charge on the Spanish guns. It was a pre-echo of the charge of the Light Brigade nearly 50 years later, and the proportionate slaughter was as great. The Poles failed to reach their target and left 60 dead and wounded behind them, out of a total complement of 88. Napoleon then proceeded to defeat the Spanish by the patient, methodical, coordinated attack he should have employed earlier. The vanguard of the Grand Army was in the suburbs of Madrid on December and all resistance in the capital had been mopped up by the 4th. Napoleon then spent 2 weeks in Madrid, usurping the functions of his restored brother King Joseph. The junta of nobles who had assembled in Bayonne earlier in the year to endorse Joseph had merely abolished torture and the majorats but had left many Bourbon institutions intact. Napoleon now went much further, by sweeping away all relics of feudalism, the Inquisition and the old Bourbon system of taxation. With winter descending fast, he again reorganized his army, ready for a rather different sort of campaigning. He managed to alienate Madrileños by bombastic speeches about Spain's backwardness, and his own role as liberator, of which the following is a fair sample: "Your grandchildren will bless me as your redeemer. The day when I appeared in your midst they will count as the most memorable, and from that day Spain's prosperity will date its beginning. He was also in womanizing mood in the Spanish capital and would often call for female company. "I want a woman. Bring me a woman here and now." But his highly developed sense of smell sometimes got in the way of his pleasures. A voluptuous 16-year-old actress had to be sent home because she reeked of perfume. This was the moment when Napoleon should have moved south to deal decisively with the Spanish. Instead, he opted to take out the British. Hearing that Sir John Moore had tried to fall on his isolated right flank under Soult at Sahagun, he marched north in person, aiming to get behind Moore and cut off his retreat to Lisbon. While Soult pinned Moore, the emperor would execute a classic sur les derrières to annihilate him. But first he had to traverse the Sierra de Guadarrama in winter. This turned out to be an even more terrible exploit than the passage of the Alps during the Riaide o Marengo campaign. On the 22nd of December, the Grand Army began the ascent of the Sierra amid motionless torrents of snow and silent cataracts of ice. A circumspect man would have drawn back, but Napoleon urged his veterans on, defying them to achieve the impossible. What on the emperor's battle plans was a mere traverse was in reality a white hell, a nightmare of slithering and crashing over precipices. On this march, the army came closer to mutiny than ever before or afterwards. The poilus called out for someone to have the guts to shoot the emperor so they could all go home. Napoleon overheard the remark, but, so fragile was morale in the ranks, he dared not punish the culprits and pretended he had heard nothing. Finally, the nightmare ended and the army was through the pass. But the 2 extra days braving crevices and avalanches had made all the difference. Moore had made good his escape and won the race to Astorga, which was where the emperor had planned to encircle him. Since a completely satisfactory outcome was no longer feasible, Napoleon handed over the pursuit to Soult and Ney, but not before he had reduced the size of the pursuing force and sent the balance back to help the hard-pressed Joseph in Madrid. Moore decided to evacuate his army at Corunna using the Royal Navy, but the 2 marshals caught up with him before the evacuation was complete. Moore was forced to turn and deal with his pursuers. In a hard-fought engagement on 6 January 809, he repulsed Soult and Ney, inflicting Sioux casualties for the loss of 80. He himself was killed by a cannonball, but the rest of the British army got off safely onto the waiting transports. On the 6th of January 809, Napoleon left Astorga for Valladolid, where he remained for 11 days, completing the military and administrative arrangements for the handover of power in Spain to Joseph and his marshals. It was in Valladolid that he made the fateful error of allowing the bickering marshals to become, in effect, warlords with semi-autonomous commands, only nominally under Joseph's suzerainty. This he did to palliate the growing unpopularity of the Peninsular War, and to give his marshals bones to gnaw on. But the long-term effect was to VTT central control from Madrid and play into the hands of the Spanish guerrillas, and, later, the British army under Wellington. Bonapartist propaganda again went into top gear to present the short imperial campaign of 1808-09 in Spain as an unalloyed personal triumph. Napoleon's mistakes were glossed over, and the incontestable fact that Napoleon had won 3 victories and chased a 4th army out of Spain duly played up. However, Moore's diversion was the really significant military event of 1808-09. By pulling Napoleon north of Madrid, he prevented the emperor's intended southward sweep, which might have ended the war at a stroke. As it was, Moore's campaign bought Portugal and southern Spain a year's respite, and meant the Spanish ulcer would continue to suppurate. Napoleon left Valladolid on the 17th of January, and was in Paris on the 23rd. Accompanied by Duroc, Savary and an escort of the guard, he rode at a fast gallop and ate up the 75 miles between Valladolid and Burgos in just 5 hours. Savary later claimed it was the fastest ride ever achieved by any monarch. From Burgos, the imperial party pressed on to Tolosa and arrived in Bayonne in the small hours of the 19th, just 4 to 5 hours after leaving Valladolid. Then it was on to Paris via Bordeaux and Poitiers. He arrived in the capital at 8 a.m. on the 23rd of January. The emperor's reasons for haste were twofold. First, he received definite intelligence in Valladolid that the Austrians were mobilizing for a spring campaign. Then came the in some ways even more disturbing news of a plot hatched in Paris by Fouché and Talleyrand to depose him and replace him with Murat. There was little time to lose.